I am 81 years old, long enough to learn that the deepest pain in a man's life rarely comes from strangers. It comes from the people he once trusted enough to leave the front door unlocked for. The man who betrayed me carried my wife's coffin at her funeral. For 43 years, I called him my best friend, and what he did to me almost destroyed something far more valuable than money. Not my life, the life inside my life, the part of me that still believed loyalty meant something. For months after I learned the truth, I stopped answering calls, stopped visiting neighbors, stopped trusting kindness whenever it came too easily. At 79 years old, I felt like a fool wearing the skin of an old man. But after all the anger and humiliation, I found something I thought age had taken away forever. Peace, real peace. And if you stay with me, maybe you'll understand why. His name was Raymond. We met when we were both 38 years old, two tired fathers trying to build stable lives for our families. I owned a small hardware store downtown. Raymond worked in insurance. For years, we barely spoke beyond small talk. Then, one winter evening, my wife became seriously ill. I remember sitting alone at my kitchen table after midnight when there was a knock at the door. It was Raymond. He was holding a pot of soup his wife had made and a bottle of whiskey tucked under his arm. He said, "You look like you shouldn't be alone tonight." I never forgot those words. He sat with me for hours while I talked about fear, marriage, and the pressure men feel to pretend they are stronger than they really are. After that night, we became inseparable. Our families spent holidays together. We took fishing trips every summer. When my son graduated, Raymond cried before I did. And when my wife passed away years later, Raymond never left my side. I still remember him gripping my arm at the funeral while I stared at my wife's coffin. At one point, I broke down so badly I couldn't stand. Raymond held me upright. That memory haunted me later, because after everything came out, I kept asking myself the same terrible question. Was any of it real? That's the cruel thing about betrayal. It doesn't only damage the present, it reaches backward and poisons the past. I retired at 67. I was never a wealthy man, but I had enough savings to live comfortably and help my grandchildren someday. By then, Raymond had become a financial advisor. He had a respected reputation, a beautiful home, and clients who trusted him completely. So, when he offered to manage my retirement savings, it didn't feel risky. It felt natural. Why would I trust a stranger more than the man who had stood beside me for most of my adult life? I signed papers I barely read. I know how foolish that sounds now, but trust makes fools out of all of us eventually. Over the years, Raymond mailed statements every few months. I rarely questioned any of it. Then, one Sunday afternoon, my son came over for dinner. He's an accountant, quiet and detail-minded like his mother was. After we ate, he casually asked if he could look over my retirement statements. At first, he said nothing. He just kept turning pages. Then I watched the color slowly drain from his face. Finally, he asked, very carefully, "Dad, how long has Raymond been handling your accounts?" I said, "Almost 9 years." My son lowered the papers onto the table. And that was the moment my old life quietly ended. Raymond had been stealing from me for nearly a decade. Not huge amounts at once, small withdrawals, hidden transfers, tiny cuts repeated over and over until more than half my savings had disappeared. Money I had spent 40 years earning. One of those withdrawals happened the same month my granddaughter needed help paying for school supplies. I remember telling her we needed to be careful with money for a while. All while Raymond was quietly taking from me behind my back that night, I called him. My son wanted lawyers involved immediately, but I asked him to let me handle the first conversation alone, because even then, part of me still hoped there was an explanation. Raymond answered on the second ring. I said, "Tell me this isn't true." There was silence. Then he sighed softly and said, "Harold, I can explain." But he couldn't. There are some betrayals too ugly for explanation. I hung up the phone, and I don't mind telling you this. I cried harder that night than I did at my wife's funeral, not because of the money, because every memory suddenly became uncertain. Every fishing trip, every holiday, every tear he shed beside my wife's grave. I sat alone in my kitchen until sunrise, wondering if any of it had been real. And at 79 years old, I experienced a loneliness so deep it frightened me. Because when strangers hurt you, life still feels understandable. But when someone you loved like family betrays you, the whole world stops making sense for a while. My son handled the legal situation. We recovered some of the money, not all of it. Raymond faced consequences for what he had done. But honestly, the legal part was the easiest part. The harder work happened afterward. Late at night, alone, mostly in that same kitchen, I was angry for a very long time. The kind of anger that follows you into bed and wakes up beside you in the morning. And healing at 79 is different than healing at 29. When you're young, you believe time is endless. But when you're old, betrayal feels heavier because you understand exactly how precious the remaining years are. Then, one evening, about 8 months later, my granddaughter came to visit. She was 12 years old, sharp as a razor. After dinner, she asked, "Grandpa, do you think Raymond was always a bad person?" I stared at the table for a long time before answering. Finally, I said, "I don't know." And strangely enough, that honest answer changed something inside me. Because the truth is, people are complicated. Sometimes weak people do terrible things while still carrying pieces of kindness inside them. That realization didn't excuse what Raymond did, but it helped me stop poisoning myself with hatred. Because here is what I finally understood at 81 years old. If you spend the rest of your life guarding yourself against every possible betrayal, you stop living before life is actually over. Raymond stole money from me. He stole years of trust, but I refused to let him steal my ability to love people. That part still belonged to me. These days, my life is quiet. I keep a small garden behind the house, tomatoes, basil, a few stubborn roses. Most mornings, I sit outside with coffee and listen to birds I never noticed when I was younger. My son visits most weekends, and my granddaughter still calls every Thursday evening without fail. Last spring, a young family moved in next door. One afternoon, the husband wandered over while I was watering the garden. Before he left, he suddenly asked if I had any advice for someone just starting out in life. I thought about it carefully. Then I said, "Give your trust slowly, and your forgiveness faster than you think you should." Because I spent too many nights hating Raymond, and not one of those nights hurt him. They only hurt me. The morning I finally let go of the weight of it, not the lesson, not the memory, but the weight, I walked outside and sat quietly in my garden. The sun felt warm on my face, warm in a way I had almost forgotten. And for the first time in a very long time, the world no longer felt dangerous to me. That's the strange thing about healing when you're old. From the outside, it doesn't look dramatic. It just looks like an old man sitting peacefully among tomato plants. But inside, it feels like freedom. At 81 years old, peace felt younger than anger ever did. Thank you for sitting with me today. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. And if you'd like, leave me a word below. I read every single one. This is Before the Silence.